In this episode of Cosmic Sponge, we kick off things with an apology and the mind poison that is Star Trek. We discover the Fountain of Youth in the most unlikely of places. Another time traveler shares details about our future, complete with a natural disaster and an uptick in stalking. And for our main topic, we look into the life of Nikola Tesla and the conspiracies surrounding his death, including his missing blueprints of weapons of mass destruction and generators of unlimited power. We even make time in this episode to consider the high cost of immortality.
You know, that's just all kinds of wrong. I don't even think I got a comment for that one.
I think after reading it, I'm like, okay, well, dying doesn't seem quite as bad now. There are worse things.
Man, you don't look like you've aged today, but you've got terrible breath.
Your halitosis smells like a latrine.
Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the podcast where we discuss weird wonders in the world. I'm Stephen Hawk.
And I'm Jimmy Cope.
Tonight we're going to be looking at the life of a historical figure whose name not only inspired an electric car company, but also a hair metal band from the 80s, an eccentric inventor, scientist, and purportedly even working on a death ray before his death in 1943. We are talking, of course, about Nikola Tesla.
Yeah, he was of the devil.
But before we get into all that, Jimmy, what have you been into this week?
What?
Before you get started, I have to make a little bit of a confession.
Yep, fair enough.
So we did miss an episode 2 weeks ago. I apologize. It was totally on me. We recorded it in plenty of time, but I just didn't get it edited in time to release it. And mainly because I've got a new subscription to Paramount, right, TV, and so I started binge watching Star Trek. Pretty much took up all my evenings. Watched Star Trek Discovery, Picard. They've got all the movies on there. I mean, Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine. I mean, if you like Star Trek, it's on there.
That's punishment enough. I think you've suffered enough.
I think the new series is pretty good, especially the first two seasons were very good.
Yeah, haven't seen it.
Yeah, you should check it out.
What's the name of it?
Discovery.
Oh, that's
Star
not
Trek
the newest
Discovery.
one. That's not the newest one.
Well, Picard. Well, there's another one called Strange New Worlds that they've only released 3 episodes so far. I've watched 2 of them.
Oh, yeah?
I haven't watched the third one yet because it's being released weekly. But it's okay. And actually, the character of Captain Pike that's in Strange New World. Strange New World is a Star Trek series that's supposed to take place on the Enterprise. It's a thunderstorm here, by the way.
Oh, nice.
It's supposed to take place on the Enterprise with Captain Pike 10 years before Captain Kirk's day. That's what Strange New Worlds is about. If you're going to watch that series, I would recommend at least watching the first 2 seasons of Discovery first, because he plays a big part in, Captain Pike does, in the second season of Star Trek Discovery. And I didn't think I would like Discovery because I've been disappointed with Star Trek so many times. Next Generation was I always felt like 1 in 3 episodes were good. The other 2 you kind of had to suffer through, like on the holodeck or a Q episode or something lame. But there's always those good ones in between, you know.
Right. You can either spend your time watching Star Trek or counting toothpicks. Whatever floats your boat, you know. I'm just saying.
Not a Star Trek fan, I know.
Well, I like the original Star Trek, loved Wrath of Khan, but, the new stuff, not my kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not enough double-fisted.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, not enough double-fisted Kirk attacks for me, with that cool music going in the background.
Dun, 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 dun.
Exactly. That's my Trek.
Or the guitar going...
It was the 60s, baby.
I love it, man. Love it.
The best.
I would say about Discovery and Picard, both are more modern, that are designed more like a new, modern streaming type series. So they connect. The stories are good, really well written. I like them, man. You should check them out. My endorsement of Star Trek.
I've still got like 300 boxes of toothpicks I got to go through. So I'll get around to it.
All right, so there's what I've been up to for 2 weeks. So what have you been doing?
I have been searching for the fountain of youth. I'm getting older and I don't like it, and I found it in
Ponce Jimmy Lawn.
Ponce Jimmy Lawn. Yes, I am Ponce Jimmy Lawn, and I found the fountain of youth in the most unlikely of places. It is in
your backyard.
Nope, it's in the poop of kids.
Oh God! Where do you find these things, man?
This is from Science News.
Okay.
Fecal transplants reverse hallmarks of aging. In the search for eternal youth, fecal transplants, that's poop, people, may seem like an unlikely way to reverse the aging process. However, scientists have provided evidence from research in mice that transplanting fecal microbiota from young to old mice can reverse hallmarks of aging in the gut, eyes, and brain. In the reverse experiment, microbes from aged mice induced inflammation in the brain of young recipients and depleted a key protein required for normal vision. These findings show that gut microbes play a role in regulating some of the detrimental effects of aging and open up the possibility of gut microbe-based therapies to combat decline later in life. So basically just eat poop from a primary school and you're going to be in good shape. That's my takeaway from it.
You know, that's just all kinds of wrong. I don't even think I got a comment for that one.
I think after reading it, I'm like, okay, well, dying doesn't seem quite as bad now.
Yeah.
There are worse things. Your breath stinks, but your skin looks beautiful. You have that healthy head of hair, but Lord, you smell like poop.
Man, you don't look like you've aged today, but you've got terrible breath.
Your halitosis smells like a latrine.
I have another message from the future.
Of course you do. Eat more poop. That's the message.
No.
What is it?
It's like drink more Ovaltine. Yeah, another time traveler's posted a couple of things that's getting ready to happen in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure which one this one is.
What's his name? I mean, does he have a normal name or does he have a weird name?
Hold on. Let's see.
Doug from the future.
The Hidden God 1. Kawhi Leonard. He's dropped a couple of videos from the future. Believe it or not, this video has been viewed 6.7 million times. And it's a leaked document from the archives. I guess the Time Traveler archives.
So what's Lenny got to tell us? Well, what's his shtick?
So there's going to be a giant earthquake on July 14th, 2022. It's going to be called the Great Split, and it'll be the America's biggest earthquake. And in the video, there's just this gigantic rift going across the planet Earth, and the two sides are opening up. Then there's just a rift and stuff falling down inside this chasm that's just going to open up in America.
Okay, so where geographically does this...
I think it's going to just split America in two.
Yeah, where's it run? So I make sure that I'm not visiting any family or anything.
He doesn't say. I guess there's only so much information you can share from the future.
Right, of course. I mean, that's the way it works.
Yeah. On August 9th, this is some more information. 2 million people around the world will mysteriously disappear.
Like Invisible Man disappear, or just...
I think just to vanish. Yeah.
Like dematerialize from the face of the planet?
Yeah, just disappear off the face of the earth. About 2 million people around the world.
That's better than having 2 million invisible men running around.
Yeah. And then on October 3rd, the last prediction from the future is these new creatures, a new species will emerge that will be known as stalkers. And they are terrifying looking.
That's a good name if they're going to be terrifying. Well, are they just terrifying looking and they're actually really nice? Like they're really helpful and kind and stuff? Or are they like meat eaters?
The name implies that they will not be nice with stalkers.
Maybe they just want to profess their love. I'm just saying. It could be just overly affectionate.
It could be, but it looks sort of like the creature. It's got claws. It's all hunched over. Its hair looks like a Medusa head almost, like snakes and stuff coming up. So, on the other hand, it could be a new cryptid. Hey, got another stalker sighting this weekend. Something like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all the warnings we have there. So be on the lookout for that, folks. July 14th, the big rift or the great split earthquake. August 9th, 2 million people will vanish. And then on October 3rd, stalkers will begin to appear around the globe.
That's something to keep you on your toes this year.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
A lot to look forward to this year.
Yep.
Yeah, and don't forget, the other time travelers said, England's going to win the World Cup and Bigfoot will be proven without a doubt. So it's going to be a busy year.
Lots going on. Speaking of which, we have had the first congressional hearing on UAPs in something like 70 years, something like that is what they
50
said.
years.
50 years.
Yeah, back in the 1960s,
with
1968. Yeah, there was the sightings. We cover this in the history of UFOs, I believe part 2. Listeners, if you want to go back and check that out. Yeah, the last congressional hearing that we had was April 5th, 1966. The result of that was they decided to have a scientific study conducted. Consequently, the University of Colorado was awarded the study, and it was led by Professor Condon and later became known as the Condon Committee, and their findings were published in the 1960s, I believe 1968. That's when they said, hey, this whole UFO thing, nothing to it. And so that pretty much put the lid on UFOs back then. But, of course, in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot more political interest in UFOs and UAPs, as they like to call them now. So we're in the midst of another congressional hearing.
Yeah, and it was interesting to hear them talk. It was enlightening. Shows us really clearly what their goals and aims are for the UAP task force. Essentially, the focus is on identifying these objects with the primary purpose being to improve the safety of their flight personnel during training missions, specifically, I think, for training missions, but maybe even in combat and such, so that they're better equipped to understand what's floating around in the skies. And I think they had like 5 buckets that they were placing these UAPs in. They're like a junk just floating around the air. And these would be things like party balloons, large mylar balloons, things that had just kicked up in the air and floating around. And then secret military stuff that is domestic, our stuff, And then there's foreign unmanned drones and foreign aircraft, those kinds of things. And then they had another bucket that they had they relegated at all the other things that didn't fit into those primary categories in which they believe most things would fall, if not all of them. But they did create another category, of which most of these 400 plus incidents are residing right now as they try to get to the bottom of it. They did talk about much of it being held in secrecy for the purposes of not giving our people around the world like Russia or China or other foreign
potential
powers,
enemies or adversaries.
Yeah, an idea of what our capabilities in terms of surveillance was.
Yeah.
So that's important, and that's reasonable. I found it really interesting that when they got to the part where some of the congressional members were questioning them on USOs, underwater, unidentified submersible objects, that they said, well, that is best to be covered in a closed session. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Wonder why that is. I guess Navy capabilities or something.
Yes.
They don't want to reveal, I suppose.
There was a direct question they asked about Maelstrom Air Force Base, the one where the nukes went offline and a UFO was reported overhead. Yeah. They said, we don't have any direct information on that. That's something we haven't been tasked with up to this point. And they said, well, what would it take for you to get tasked to get us answers on that? It says, well, someone up the chain of command essentially giving us orders to do that. So maybe that will be something we get an answer to. And then another thing I thought was interesting, a direct question to them was, do you have any recovered materials? And the answer was, we at the UAP task force do not have any recovered materials. We do not have any recovered materials which do not have a terrestrial explanation for.
Okay.
No, they were pretty clear on it. they seemed pretty tight, in terms of what people in charge of the task force were talking about. And they did also say that they were the only partner they really had at this time was the FAA, but they were bringing other partners on board to collect larger and larger data sets and collect more information going forward so that they can mine data with the intent of determining what these things in the skies are. So that's cool.
One thing that we're seeing now is they're trying to reduce or eliminate the stigma on pilots who report UAPs in both the military and civilian. So that's a positive sign. If you would have asked somebody 10 years ago that had a sighting, if they wanted to come forward or officially report something, most likely they wouldn't have. They don't want that stigma that, oh, he's a nut. He said he saw a flying saucer, right?
Yeah, and risk their advancement, for their careers.
Exactly. Yeah, in both civilian and military circles. So that's something that I know that they've talked about recently that I think is good.
Yeah, they cited the increased number of reports as evidence that it's working.
Yeah.
They are getting less stigma and more reports coming in from Navy personnel specifically. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I think from here we're going to move into tonight's main topic. Is that it, Jimmy? You got any more stories?
Nope, I'm good.
All right. Well, you brought us two tonight, so that's cool.
Keeping you on your toes.
The baby poop cures aging and congressional hearings. So,
what was it? Ponce Jimmy de Leon.
So before we jump into tonight's main topic, I want to bring something up that we haven't talked about on the show for a while, and that's, listeners, if you have a story, some type of extraordinary story, and would like to share it with us, just email the show, firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. You don't have to use your real name, or you can say, hey, just make it anonymous, and we will do that. But I would love to hear your stories. I'd like to encourage everyone, if you've had some kind of interesting encounter, whether it's Bigfoot, paranormal, or UFOs, anything, we would like to share it with our listeners on the show. So just reach out to us at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com.
Oh, to that end, we actually did get an email that came in that talked about something from one of our previous episodes. I think it was episode 50, where you had mentioned the old growth in trees on the eastern coast.
Yeah.
Apparently, there is 400,000 acres of old growth on the East Coast.
Okay.
In the Northeast.
Yeah, I remember now. I was you were talking about being out west.
Yeah.
How the forests look different than they do here in the East. And I said, well, there's hardly, I was thinking there was no virgin forest in the U.S. I mean, just off the top of my head, in the eastern United States, most of the trees have been timbered and are pretty young on average. Yep. But anyway, there's 400,000 acres somewhere that are preserved.
400,000 acres in the Northeast, and these are little groves to larger groves. I think the largest groves are in the Adirondacks. Some of these, it depends on what you define as old growth. Now, some of these trees fall within 150 years or older, but some of them are pre-Columbian.
Wow.
So we do have them, and we have some just down the street from me here, and I'm going to go check them out. There's a hemlock grove down there that's pre-Columbian. So I'm going to drive down there, take some video, and put it up on our YouTube site.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks, whoever it was. I guess you...
That was George. Our buddy George.
Well, thanks, George.
And he also sent us a book to look through that has all of the locations of old growth where Bigfoot could be hanging out, cooking rabbits and kicking his feet up, riding one wheels.
That are shaped like a surfboard.
Exactly.
The size of a surfboard.
That's right.
Well, all right. Very good. While we're on the subject, be sure to look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as we just mentioned. And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by going to our webpage, cosmicsponge.com. Look in the upper right-hand corner for a little coffee cup icon that's called Buy Me a Coffee for a one-time donation, or the link right beside it will take you to Patreon, where there are 3 very modest levels that if you choose to support the show, that will also give you access to our other show called Weird Wonders that we produce exclusively for our Patreon supporters. All right, well, on to tonight's show. Jimmy, as always, I'm sure you've done a bit of legwork on Mr. Nikola Tesla.
We are going to be talking about Nikola Tesla, the famous inventor, polyglot, father of the modern power grid, pigeon whisperer, an extreme pacifist. Let's begin. Nikola adjusted the coil on his newly constructed death ray. No doubt this baby could mow down battalions of men in a matter of seconds. And whoa-wee! The number of planes he could blast out of the sky. Nikola couldn't wait to get this new invention into as many hands as possible. You see, the only way to world peace, he reasoned, was obviously through a fully functional death ray. Nikola desperately needed an influx of cash to execute his ingenious peace plan. He discussed it with the pigeons, and everyone agreed this was the best course of action. Once the death ray had been deployed, he would then use the profits to construct a force field generator, making all weapons of war obsolete. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, Nikola wouldn't get to see his plan for peace realized. Plagued by unforeseen disasters, funding problems, bad press initiated by Edison and that thieving Italian bastard Marconi, he was lucky if he had enough money to feed his pigeon army, much less advance his plan. Eventually, a maid would discover the body of this extraordinary genius in a New York hotel room decorated in pigeon poo. His papers and designs, confiscated by the FBI, would spawn conspiracies, which survive to this day, with much of it focused on his unrealized inventions and how his missing designs may yet hold secrets, long relegated to the realm of science fiction. Tonight, we look into this bizarre claims behind the creations of this fascinating man, from death rays and force fields to free wireless energy and robots, in an effort to separate fact from fiction. This is the story of Nikola Tesla.
Interestingly, he was born July 10th, 1856. It is said that he was born in the middle of a thunderstorm. Guess what's going on right now at my house while we're doing this episode? A thunderstorm.
That's spooky. My favorite thing on his birth that I heard was Tesla was born at the stroke of midnight. Some say during a lightning storm. His mother used a swig of whiskey and some rough-cut leather, the old-timey form of an epidural. And his first cry was followed by a soft flute-like fart that left the faint scent of unseasoned bacon with a hint of honeysuckle in the air.
That is definitely mythical.
The mythical Tesla.
You made that up.
I did. Just with some rough-cut leather between clenched, crooked teeth.
When he was born during this thunderstorm, the midwife allegedly said, "This baby is going to be the child of darkness." Tesla's mother replied, "No, he's going to be a child of light," which maybe he was. He did patent the arc light.
All the lights in my house are based on what he kicked off, I guess.
It depends. The light bulb itself with the tungsten filament was invented by Edison.
Or, one of his lackeys, and he just took credit for it.
Right, which unless you've got a fluorescent bulb above your head right now, fluorescent lights were invented by Tesla. But now on the arc light that he invented, he was cheated out of the patent by two businessmen in New Jersey.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with his early years. Tesla was born on midnight during a lunar eclipse and lightning storm, including a tornado that picked up his house and killed a witch. We got that all the way. His father was a priest, and his mother took care of the farmstead. Now, his mother was able to remember these long Serbian poems. Many think that she had an eidetic memory, which she passed on to Tesla, even training him in techniques that would help you remember things, particularly these long, complicated things. He spends time in his primary school. He learns physics and maths. Then he goes on to an engineering school.
Well, he was raised on the farm, and yes, his father was a priest, and it's said his mother came up with some inventions around the farm. I don't know what specifically, but she apparently had the knack for creating little devices to make her work easier on the farm. So he may have got his inventiveness from his mother. Most certainly the memory tricks and things like that.
Oh, definitely, because his father was spending all of his time in the church. Tesla completes lower primary school and then attends lower real gymnasium, which I thought was really weird, which is also referred to as normal school, followed by the real gymnasium. Basically, he attended the equivalent of what today is primary school up to graduate level college. And most kids today make it to high school. But back then, you got basically a college degree by the time you got out of high school. There is one notable thing. I saw this everywhere, and I wanted to get a sense from you on what you thought about it. Tesla's older brother, Dane, dies at age 12. when Tesla is
Yep.
around
Nikola
5 years
was
old.
only 5 years old. Yeah.
Now, some people say that this unlocked some mystical powers inside of Tesla's mind, allowing him to fully visualize and realize inventions for the rest of his life, fully complete, and all he'd have to do is put them together. And then other people say that this unlocked some kind of mental distress that would live with him to the end of his days and get worse as he got older.
Everyone seems to agree on the fact that he had a very vivid imagination. He could sometimes, especially when he was younger, that his visions would almost manifest themselves, and he would have difficulty separating reality from his mind or his imagination. But then I've heard that he gained control of that when he was 16 and was able to use his visions. In other words, he was able to say an invention that he was thinking about, or a principle of electricity, which he was particularly interested in. He was able to visualize the whole machine or device in his mind and be able to tell the results of how it worked, sort of like trial and error in his mind before he ever sat down to build the device itself. And that's what they say, that he was able to fully manifest these ideas. A lot of it was, and again, his, like you had mentioned earlier, his photographic memory, was able to read books very quickly and retain a massive amount of information.
So he finishes up, his early education, and then in 1870 he moves to live with his aunt and Colonel Old War Horse Brankovic, and this is in Croatia, what is modern-day Croatia. This is where he attends higher real gymnasium, where a teacher, Martin Skolik, teaches him math and physics and has a decisive influence on him. Graduates from there a year early. Then Tesla returns to his hometown and then contracts cholera and is bedridden for 9 months. Nearing death, his father, in a moment of desperation, says to him, if you just get better, I will let you go to engineering school.
Right. His father wanted him to be a priest.
Yeah.
Yeah, they say the cholera saved him from a life of priesthood.
Right. He recovers from cholera, and in order to avoid the army, because there was a required 3-year service that you had to do at that time, he went to Tamangaj. That was to get out of the compulsory 3 years of service. And later, Tesla had stated that for most of that time, he roamed in the mountains loaded with a hunter's outfit and a bundle of books. And he had direct contact with nature, and it made his body stronger and his mind stronger and prepared him for the next part of his life. That would be enrolling in a polytechnic school in Graz on a military border scholarship. So in his first year, he never missed a lecture, made the highest possible grades. But then in his second year, he met with a Professor Polschall and saw the Graham dynamo and suggested that the communicators weren't necessary in that design. And by the end of the second year, for whatever reason, some suspect that he started, taking up the bottle and, doing a little bit of gambling and maybe a little bit of womanizing. And so he basically flunked out.
Now, the story I heard was that while he's in college, this dynamo, this DC-powered motor, which is inefficient, and it has these metal plates on it that will wear out. It's got these metal plates that it has to turn inside of, that has this direct contact. The sides of the cylinder, which are turning, have direct contact with the motor casing, that those will wear out over time. And that's part of what causes sparks, and it's what creates a lot of noise, a lot of energy wasted. That's when he first begins envisioning this AC-powered motor using magnetic fields. He becomes very obsessed with this design, and that particular professor, whenever he brings up and says, what if you used AC power for this motor? And that particular professor said that would never work. And he becomes very obsessed with designing this motor, not necessarily in a physical sense, but more or less in his mind, trying to put together how these problems can be solved. Now, that's the story I heard. I didn't hear any story that he took to drinking or gambling or anything like that.
This is straight from his TeslaUniverse.com, where they go through a timeline of his life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not clear exactly whether he took up drinking to extremes or anything like that, but he did choose to live in Maribor. Not really sure why. He left Austria. He's living in Slovenia. Took up a job as a draftsman for a local engineering firm and spent a lot of his time at a pub called the Happy Peasant, where he played chess and cards. Eventually, his father comes to Maribor and pleads with him to come home. Tesla says, nah, ain't doing it, Pops. So then he gets kicked out of Maribor because he didn't have a residence permit. Then he returned to his hometown under police guard. So that's in 1879. 1880, his uncles, Petar and Pavel, come to his rescue and put together enough money to allow him to go to Prague. And then he arrived there a little bit too late to enroll in Karl Ferdinand University, but even if he had gotten there in time, he wouldn't have been permitted to enroll because it required you to be able to speak Greek. He couldn't, and he didn't speak or write Czech either. He lived there for a little while, spent time in the library and at a cafe, and then he did attend lectures at the university as an auditor, but didn't receive marks on the courses. Then his uncle arranges for him to work at a telephone exchange in Hungary. And he works there for a little while, and they realize his genius, his capabilities. They promote him up and up and up. He begins to make improvements on equipment and develops an amplifier device. In February 1882, this is where he theoretically, I guess, or supposedly, hypothetically, nearly suffers a mental breakdown, and says he isn't expected to live, but then he begins to recover, and during a short walk in a city park in Budapest with one of his friends, the solution to this alternating current problem comes to his mind, and it comes to his mind as he's reciting a passage from Faust. And again, who knows if this is true or not, but he draws this induction motor in the sand with a stick. He's then working for the Continental Edison Company, and he's sent to Strasbourg, France, to repair a DC lighting system installed at the German railway company that was damaged on a trial run. After this, his boss essentially goes to New York to the main headquarters of Edison and takes Tesla along with him, essentially.
And that was a big deal. He arrives in New York. Edison's his hero, and he's everyone. It's an inventor's hero at that time. He arrives with, I think, 4 cents in his pocket when he arrives in America and he shows up on Edison's doorstep in America with a letter of recommendation from the head of the division that's in Europe. Goes to work for Edison. Works there about 6 months. Now, from what I understand, he was disappointed working for Edison. For one thing, Edison's promoting using DC power for the new electrical grids. Most cities at that time were cities like London were using natural gas, these gas lights. The street lamps were all using gas. What we started seeing was this transition to electrical power, something that Edison was very interested in. He invented this light bulb. Him and his company was trying to capitalize on setting up these electrical grids in big cities like New York City. Very first electrical grid was set up in Long Island using DC power. Now, during this time, Tesla works for Edison for about 6 months and becomes disillusioned with him because he's got this idea for the AC electric motor, which could revolutionize electricity, but already Edison's promoting using DC power, direct current, which is not compatible with alternating current. Now, today, when you think of DC or direct current, typically that is in a low voltage situation. Like today, something that runs on batteries, like a couple of AA batteries, that would be direct current. Alternating current is what, of course, runs into your house from the power lines that are outside. It's much more efficient to run at long distances. We'll get into that a little bit in a few minutes. But because Edison's already pushing DC, the ideas and the inventions that Nikola Tesla, who shows up at Edison thinking, Edison's going to see all my ideas and how much better AC power is, and he'll, embrace that, which he didn't. Now, there is a myth, Jimmy, you was talking about this myth that Nikola Tesla was going to solve this problem for Edison.
There was a lot of designs that Tesla had that worked on AC power. And the story goes that Edison says, we'll make them work with DC power. And if you make all these various things work with DC power, then we'll pay you $50,000. And he does it. And then Edison says, no, come on, Tesla. You just don't understand our American sense of humor. You're Serbian. I mean, you Serbians don't have a sense of humor. That's the problem here. You know, get $50,000.
That's an American joke, right? Or something like that.
And that didn't happen. It's possible that his boss at the time, his direct boss, which was Batchelor, I can't remember his first name. His last name was Batchelor, was really stingy with pay and had given this task to Tesla, promising a bonus, and it didn't come to fruition. That's possible, but even that's not certain based on what I've read. So maybe just more myth added to the legend of Tesla. I'm not sure.
The way I understand it, he's become disillusioned with, hey, it looks like all Edison's interested in is working with DC power. All of my ideas and designs are for AC power. Now, AC power was being experimented a little more predominantly in Europe than it was in America. It could be another reason why Tesla brought these ideas with him when he immigrated to the United States. Regardless of whether that's true or not, he ends up leaving working for Edison after about 6 months.
Soon after leaving there, that's when he starts working on patenting the arc lighting system that he had started working on under Edison. And he uses Edison's patent attorney to get it submitted. And that patent attorney, Lemuel W. Sorel, introduces him to two businessmen, Robert Lane and Benjamin Val, who agree to finance an arc lighting manufacturing company and utility company in Tesla's name. And they call it the Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing. Tesla works there for the rest of the year, obtaining the patents that included the improved DC generator, the first patents issued to Tesla in the United States, and building and installing a system in Rahway, New Jersey. Some of Tesla's new system gained notice in technical press, which commented on its advanced features. However, the investors showed little interest in Tesla's idea for new types of alternating current motors and electrical transmission equipment. And then after the utility was up and running in 86, they decided the manufacturing side of the business was too competitive and opted to simply run an electric utility. They formed a new utility company, abandoned Tesla's company, leaving the inventor penniless, and he even lost control of the patents he had generated since he had assigned them to the company in exchange for stock. He worked at various electrical repair jobs after that, and as a ditch digger for just $2 a day. The worst time in his life, and he even was quoted as saying, "My high education in various branches of science, mechanics, and literature seemed to me like a mockery. I should have gone into women's studies." Okay, he didn't say the thing about the women's studies, but he could have. In late 1886, he meets Alfred S. Brown, who was a Western Union superintendent, and Charles Fletcher Peck, who was a New York attorney, and the two men who are experienced in setting up companies and promoting inventions and patents for financial gain back Tesla. Together, they formed the Tesla Electric Company in April of 1887 with an agreement that profits from the generated patents would go 1/3 to Tesla, 1/3 to Peck and Brown, and 1/3 to fund the development. They set up a laboratory for him where he worked on improving and developing two types of electrical motors, generators, and other devices. So in 1887, Tesla developed an induction motor that ran on alternating current, which was a power system that was rapidly expanding in Europe and the United States because of its advantages in long-distance, high-voltage transmission, something that DC power wasn't capable of. The motor used a polyphase current and generated a rotating magnetic field to turn the motor. This inventive electrical motor was patented in 1888 and was a simple self-starting design that did not need a communicator, thus avoiding sparking and the high maintenance of constantly servicing and replacing mechanical bushings. So then Peck and Brown arranged to get the motor publicized, starting with independent testing to verify that it was a functional improvement. These press releases brought it to the attention of engineers working for the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. They reported to George Westinghouse that Tesla had a viable AC motor and related power system, something that Westinghouse needed for the alternating current system he was already marketing. Westinghouse looked into getting a patent on a similar communicator-less rotator magnetic field-based induction motor developed in 1885 and presented it in a paper in 1888 by Italian physicist Galileo Ferraris, but decided that Tesla's patent would probably control the market. And that's how Tesla gets picked up by Westinghouse.
I just want to take a moment here to talk about the War of the Currents. This is a very interesting time in America. George Westinghouse had made his fortune in the railroad industry. He had invented air brakes for railroad locomotives. And at this time, the railroad was being expanded all across the United States. and started looking at diversifying, of course, his business and other inventions and things. He was most definitely a contemporary and a rival to Edison. But let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of the electrical grids in the world, really, and the difference between AC and DC power. Now, often when you hear about the War of the Currents, contemporary accounts of this now have Edison squaring off against Tesla as if Tesla was a major player in this, when in reality he wasn't. A lot of his inventions were based on using AC electrical power as opposed to DC, as it was more efficient. But he really wasn't a player when it came to the things that were going on in the press, and Edison versus Westinghouse was really the two big ones that were competing. This whole situation began to develop in the late 1880s and 1890s, and it grew out of essentially the two lighting systems that were developed in the 70s and 1870s and 1880s. The arc light street lighting ran on high voltage alternating current or low volt direct current used incandescent lighting that was marketed by Edison. So Edison kind of got a head start building electrical grids, but the problem with DC power, in order to transmit power, if the world would have adopted DC power as opposed to AC power, you would have had to have a generating plant within every mile wherever your load was. But AC allowed you to build these large high transmission wires and then use step down transformers. So when you look out on your electrical pole across the street or above your house, that transformer is a step down transformer before it comes down into your house. And that steps it down to 240 volts. That's what enters every home. And so it allows you to transmit power at much farther distances. A way to think about it is, if you think about DC power, let's say you have a generator or a battery, and if it's a stream, let's say think of it as like water running through a pipe. It's going in a big circle and it's completing the circuit. It uses up some of the current as it's going to each load. And by the time you get to the end of the load, you hardly have any current left. It's a flow of electrons. But with alternating current from the generator, it actually goes back and forth. It's sort of like it flows one way and then flows the other way. It flows back and forth. So that way that the things on the end of your circuit have the same amount of power as the ones in the beginning of your circuit, because in a sense, the circuit's what was the beginning of the circuit becomes the end, and vice versa. Kind of difficult to explain on a podcast, but without some...
I felt like I was back in a high school science class, and I remembered why I started eating crayons in the first place.
Right. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but just to understand that when you hear the War of the Currents, I mean, when I thought of the War of the Currents, I thought I was going to read a whole lot about Nikola Tesla, and actually he's not in the story a whole lot. It was mostly between Westinghouse and Edison as they were fighting this out in the press. For one thing, AC power is very dangerous, and electricity was very new. And so what was happening is these linemen were being electrocuted. In fact, the New York Times came up with that term. It was mysterious. People would grab a hold of this electricity and then they just died, right? Nobody knew why. I mean, their body looks perfectly fine. It became apparent that AC-powered electricity was much more dangerous than DC. And so linemen, being inexperienced, were dying. And I mean, the average person didn't realize what electricity was or that the wires were dangerous. There was a downed telegraph wire that was AC that killed a teenager. And so Edison used this in the press to say, look, AC power is really dangerous. And in fact, and it's a really long story of how they did this, but that's how the electric chair in the state of New York became adopted as a way to execute prisoners, because New York State had a few botched hangings, which was the preferred method of executing people on death row, and they were looking for a better way, and an AC-powered electric chair was chosen, and Westinghouse didn't want to have anything to do with it. And there was some shady dealings, and they were able to acquire 3 Westinghouse generators. Westinghouse didn't want to have anything to do with it because he's trying to play down the bad publicity. I mean, Edison and his proponents for DC power would have these demonstrations where they would electrocute animals.
Yeah, they started out small and they worked their way up to big.
Yeah. And to show how dangerous AC power was.
They eventually electrocuted a circus elephant to death. What kind of bastards electrocutes a circus? I mean, why would you electrocute a circus elephant to death when you've got plenty of clowns laying around?
Exactly.
I'm just saying.
But I don't want to get into this too much because we're talking about Tesla and we still have a long way to go. But it was an interesting time in America. In the end, AC power won out just because of the economy of scale. DC power required much more wire. Copper was expensive to produce as it is today. It required a larger gauge of wire to produce enough electricity. You could not transmit DC power very far. And so the economy of scale in the long run was AC power was adopted. Edison kind of gave up the fight. For one thing, he had moved on, interested in some other things, not to mention he was getting older at the time, and by the time the 1890s came around, and there was a financial merger with General Electric, and he became a little less important in the company. But anyway, I thought it was pretty interesting that some cities had continued to use DC because even as this war is going on, some cities were adopting the DC power. Helsinki, for instance, had a DC network into the late 1940s. Stockholm had a DC network as late as the 1970s. They had a mercury arc valve rectifier station that converted AC to DC where networks were still used in parts of Boston, Massachusetts. And they had 110 volt DC up into the 1960s. New York City's Broadway theaters continued to use DC services until 1975. It says here that in January 1998, Consolidated Edison started to eliminate DC service.
You mean
at the time,
1898?
1998.
What?
1998. In January 1998, Consolidated Edison, was the remnants of Edison's company, started to eliminate DC service. At that time, there were 4,600 DC customers. By 2006, there were only 60 customers using DC service. On November 14th, 2007, the last direct current distribution by Con Edison was finally shut down.
Where were those people? 68 people, what were they, in Oklahoma?
No, in Washington, D.C.
Oh, in Washington? What?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to think those early DC networks were set up
In the Northeast.
in these cities, big cities.
big cities,
So,
yeah.
it makes sense that it was like Boston or Helsinki or Stockholm or whatever that still had some of these DC grids. Anyway, pretty interesting stuff. But it's a long story. But I just kind of wanted to dispel the myth that when you think about the War of the Currents, and you hear a lot like, well, we owe AC power and the way we do things today all to Nikola Tesla. It's not entirely accurate. In fact, AC power was already being adopted in Europe, and I think that's one reason his ideas, him coming from Serbia, being trained in technical colleges in Europe, coming to the United States, it may be a little more advanced, the idea of using AC power in Europe as opposed to the United States. It was really more between Edison and George Westinghouse, although Tesla was an employee of George Westinghouse and had a further association with him, as we'll soon find out.
What? I'm telling you, I feel like I'm back at science class. All right, let's get to the fun stuff, okay? So Tesla, yes, he does this alternating current induction motor. He does this steam-powered oscillating generator. Consults on a power plant in Niagara.
It was the first hydroelectric power plant in the world at Niagara Falls. Essentially, what they did was take his alternating current motor, instead of placing electricity in it, creating the magnetic field and turning it, right? Okay, let's let the water turn the motor, essentially.
Exactly.
With a few modifications, and it's going to make electricity.
Right. Then he forms the Nikola Tesla Company, and here's where he creates a lot of patents along with Peck and Brown, and he has he finds some new investors, and everything's going great. And then he has a lab fire in 1895, which destroys a lot of his work and brings him back to ground zero on some of his stuff. And it was very much a traumatic experience for Tesla because so much of his work was lost in that fire, and it was probably started by a time traveler. And then in 1894, he began investigating things he referred to as radiant energy. He becomes friends with Mark Twain, so this guy's in the know, right? He takes pictures of Mark Twain and gets like a bizarre result from the photograph, and later realizes that he's actually taken an X-ray of Mark Twain. So we have somewhere out there is a really crappy X-ray of Mark Twain produced by Nikola Tesla.
So there's a weird X-ray of Mark Twain out there.
Yeah, and then that famous photograph, there's a famous photograph of Tesla sitting next to his Tesla coil with it going off.
Yeah.
Like he's sitting there reading a paper or something. That's actually a double exposure. Like so a double exposure, folks, with a film is basically where you shoot a film twice, and the first time you shoot it, Tesla's sitting there reading the paper, and then he leaves the room while this Tesla coil's going off, and then shoots a second.
And it's a gigantic Tesla coil, so there's all kinds of electrical bolts shooting off of this thing.
Yeah, the dude would have been fried. He'd been dead. But it shot that, and then they layer them, essentially what you do in Photoshop when I'm making the Instagrams. Yeah, that was more of like a marketing ploy for Tesla. Certainly, he was had a little bit of theatrics in him. Had jazz hands, as it were.
I mean, Nikola Tesla had all these patents that we talked about, something like, what'd you say, 278 patents that we know of. A lot of innovations, a lot of ideas. He was not a good businessman, unlike Edison and Westinghouse, who were able to capitalize on their ideas and their inventions. It seems that Nikola Tesla would be flush with cash from time to time, and then for whatever reason, would end up penniless again. It happened to him several times during his life. Is there anything you want to talk about before broadcast power?
Yeah, before that, he actually comes up with a radio remote control. Utilizing radio waves was one of Tesla's patents that would cause a little bit of frustration for him, because across the world, a Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian, at the same time comes up with ideas for utilizing radio waves. Tesla, though, beats him to the patents. And eventually Marconi would receive, along with another gentleman, the Nobel Prize for his discovery of radio waves, and not concede anything to Tesla, even though Tesla had patents to prove that he had gotten there first. So it wasn't until after Tesla dies that he wins the court cases against Marconi in terms of the use of patents.
Yeah, Marconi is widely recognized today as the inventor of radio, and he was the first one to broadcast on radio.
Across the Atlantic. Well,
that's really what the Nobel Prize was about. Now, Nikola Tesla was looking at using radio control. I know he built a radio control boat. When it came to a practical application for radio waves, being able to transmit this long-distance wireless transmission, that was Marconi, and that's really where the Nobel Prize came from. But he did violate Tesla's patents, and it was after Tesla's death that it was finally recognized that, Tesla had already been aware of some of these properties and had patented this device before Marconi. But anyway, too little, too late.
Yeah, it's important to recognize how extraordinary at this time in history it was to have a remote-controlled boat. Because people were sitting there thinking that there was magic going on, and some people even claimed that there was a little monkey inside the boat making it zoom around, because they couldn't believe that there was actually some kind of transmission that was occurring from Tesla's device in his hands to this boat that was zipping around the water.
To the transmitter, to the receiver. Yeah. I mean, even electricity, you have to think in these late 1800s, that's why so many people died. They just didn't know. I mean, it was just this mysterious force to them. You think of the average person, electricity was a mysterious force that would make lights come on. Gas, you kind of understood. It's natural gas. It's going through these pipes, and I burn it, right? But electricity, what's this stuff? And now here we are, a wireless transmitter magically making this boat turn in the water and everything. It's pretty amazing stuff. So, the people in those days would have thought it was magic.
Yeah, and this leads into Tesla's big invention that was probably, like you were saying, Steve, the big downfall of Tesla, right, is wireless power.
So this was an idea that Tesla had come up with called wireless power or broadcast power. He had the dream that instead of having to use transmission wires that we still use today, such as high-tension wires, that electricity could actually be transmitted through the air, providing free electricity and free power to light your home or to heat your home.
So then he's doing this research, and he opens up a laboratory in Colorado Springs. And this is after, he has the fire and the losses there in New York. And he's looking into setting up an experimental station at a high altitude in Colorado Springs in 1899. and there he could safely operate larger coils than he could in the cramped confines of his New York laboratories. There he conducted experiments with large coil operating megavolts in the megavolts range and producing artificial lightning and thunder, and that's where we get this double exposure photograph that we were talking about earlier. This is where, during the time in the laboratory, he speculated that maybe he was receiving communications from another planet, so he was the first guy to talk to aliens, apparently. And this feeds into the mythos, because the myth that is Nikola Tesla develops over lots of years of these extraordinary events happening on this cutting edge of development that's going on this time all across the world. And Tesla's at the forefront of a lot of it, at least in the media. I mean, we have this radio-controlled boat. We have this large Tesla coil where you see him setting around, being unaffected by this electricity that's blowing about around him. And people don't know that it's a double exposed photograph. He's getting signals from outer space that seem to be intelligently controlled. Tesla's building up this whole mythical background behind him, making him a celebrity, allowing him to get some money from investors, and allowing him to continue on with his experiments, which leads to probably the pinnacle of his work, which is Wardenclyffe. And this is a large tower on Long Island that he builds with the intention of producing wireless energy from this tower out into the world for free. And to give an example of how, or an actual working example of this idea he has for wireless transmission of energy. And this is where he runs out of funds.
Yeah, he spent through the 1890s to 1906, he spent a great deal of his time and fortune on a series of projects trying to develop the transmission of electrical power without wires. It was an expansion of his idea using coils to transmit power that he had been demonstrating in wireless lighting. He saw this as not only the way to transmit large amounts of power around the world, but also, as he had pointed out in earlier lectures, a way to transmit worldwide communications. He made the rounds in New York trying to find investors for what he thought would be a viable system of wireless transmission. And of course, he knew a lot of people in those days. He was quite famous, rubbed shoulders with a lot of famous, influential people. In March 1901, he obtained $150,000. Today, that would be worth about $4.5 to $5 million. I think, let's see. Yeah, that would equate to $4.8 million in today's money. So he obtained $150,000 from J.P. Morgan in return for a 51% share of any generated wireless patents, and began planning the Wardenclyffe Tower facility, which he built in New York, 100 miles east of the city on the north shore of Long Island. By 1901, Tesla had expanded his plans to build a more powerful transmitter to leap ahead of Marconi's radio-based system, which Tesla thought was a copy of his own. He approached Morgan to ask for more money to build the larger system, but Morgan refused to supply any further funds. In December 1901, Marconi successfully transmitted the letter S from England to Newfoundland.
Newfoundland.
Marconi successfully transmitted from England to Newfoundland, defeating Tesla in the race to be the first to complete a transmission. A month after Marconi's success, Tesla tried to get Morgan to back an even larger plan to transmit messages and power by controlling vibrations throughout the globe. Over the next 5 years, Tesla wrote more than 50 letters to Morgan, pleading for and demanding additional funding to complete the construction of Wardenclyffe. Tesla continued the project for another 9 months into 1902. The tower was erected to a full height of 187 feet. In June of 1902, Tesla moved his lab operations from Houston Street to Wardenclyffe. Investors on Wall Street were putting their money into Marconi's system, and some of the press began turning against Tesla's project, claiming it was a hoax. The project came to a halt in 1905 and in 1906. The financial problems and other events may have led to what Tesla biographer Mark Seifer suspects was another nervous breakdown. Tesla mortgaged the Wardenclyffe property to cover his debts at the Warden Astoria, which eventually amounted to about $20,000, which would be about $500,000 today. He lost the property in foreclosure in 1915, and in 1917, the tower was demolished by the new owner to make the land more viable for real estate. So you can go online and see pictures of this enormous tower that were built, but the project was never quite finished. After this, nobody seemed to want to invest in Tesla anymore because that was a lot of money invested in him, and of course nothing ever happened. Nothing ever became of it. So even after J.P. Morgan died, Tesla wrote to Morgan's son Jack trying to get further funding for the project. It looks like he spent most of his life trying to get funding for this project that was never really developed.
So Tesla, as he's getting older, in 1934, he tells reporters that he's designed a superweapon he claimed that would end all war, and he called it Teleforce. But it's usually referred to as his death ray. Now, death ray was something that was going around the world at that time where everybody was talking about developing a death ray. Everybody had to have a death ray. I got a death ray. You got a death ray. Everybody got a death ray. Tesla, not to be outdone, had his death ray. But that wasn't the only thing that he had. In 1935, on his 79th birthday party, Tesla covered many topics. He claimed to have discovered the cosmic ray in 1896 and invented a way to produce direct current by induction, and made many claims about his mechanical oscillator. This device, he told reporters, was a version which caused an earthquake in his 46 East Houston Street lab and neighborhood streets in Lower Manhattan in 1898. He went on to tell reporters that this oscillator could destroy the Empire State Building with 5 pounds of air pressure. He explained a new technique he developed using his oscillators he called telegeodynamics, using it to transmit vibrations into the ground that he claimed could work over any distance to be used for communication or locating underground mineral deposits or destroying the Empire State Building. This brings us to the big thing that I really want to talk about, which is Teleforce, his death ray, which we mentioned before. And everybody had the death ray, which I mentioned before. And not to be outdone, Tesla had the death ray of all death rays.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about how this came about. Right. The talk of the death ray and some of this kind of thing. And I think a lot of this is where you start getting into and it's sort of what made me think of why this should even be a subject of how he's kind of entered this world of mythology about his inventions. I mean, think about it. The figure of this individual's in movies. I mean, he made the appearance in, what was the one about the magicians? What was that called? The Prestige.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anytime you see Tesla in movies these days, modern movies, he's like this inventing teleportation and all kinds of these crazy inventions and things like that. And a lot of it is, because of this. And then, of course, during his, and of course, after his death, the FBI did enter his lab and take papers and things, but this was in the midst of World War II. The government just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything there that may aid the Germans if they didn't get there first. It's understandable. But the way some of his later ideas later in life emerged was in 1931, Tesla had been befriended a journalist, Kenneth Sweezy, and they wanted to celebrate his 75th birthday. During his birthday, Tesla had received congratulatory letters from more than 70 pioneers in science and engineering, including Einstein. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine. Cover caption said, "All the world his powerhouse," noted his contribution to electrical power generation. The party went so well that Tesla made it an annual event, an occasion where he would put out a large spread of food and drink featuring dishes of his own creation. He invited the press in order to see his inventions and hear stories about his past exploits, views on current events, and some baffling claims. So these are where some of these claims came from. So at a 1932 party, Tesla claimed that he invented a motor that would run on cosmic rays. In 1933, at the age of 77, Tesla told reporters at the event that after 35 years of work, he was on the verge of producing proof of a new form of energy. He claimed it was a theory of energy that was violently opposed to the Einsteinian physics and could be tapped with an apparatus that would be cheap to run and last 500 years. He also told reporters he was working on a way to transmit individualized private radio wavelengths, working on breakthroughs in metallurgy, and developing a way to photograph the retina to record thought. In 1934, during one of his annual parties, Tesla told reporters that he had designed a super weapon he claimed could end all war. He called it the Teleforce. but was usually referred to as his death ray. Tesla described it as a defensive weapon that would be put up along the border of a country and be used against attacking ground-based infantry or aircraft. Tesla never revealed the detailed plans of how the weapon worked during his lifetime, but in 1984 they surfaced at the Nikola Tesla Museum archive in Belgrade. The paper was The New Art of Projecting Concentrated Non-Dispersive Energy Through the Natural Media, described an open-ended vacuum tube with a gas jet seal that allowed particles to exit, a method of charging slugs of tungsten or mercury to millions of volts and directing them in streams through electrostatic repulsion. Tesla tried to interest the U.S. War Department, United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia in this device. And later on questions concerning the death ray, Tesla stated, "It is not an experiment. I have built, demonstrated, and used it. Only a little more time will pass before I can give it to the world." I think it's important to note when we talk about the death ray in relation to Nikola Tesla, in the 1930s, this was not an exclusive idea. In 1923, Edwin R. Scott, an inventor in San Francisco, claimed that he was the first to develop a death ray that would destroy human life and bring down planes at a distance. When he tried to sell what he reported to be a death ray to the British Air Ministry in 1924, but he was never able to show a functioning model. Antonio Longoria in 1934 claimed to have a death ray that could kill pigeons from 4 miles away and could kill a mouse enclosed in a thick-walled metal chamber. And during World War II, the Germans had at least 2 projects, and the Japanese one to create so-called death rays. One German project concerned a particle accelerator, which, of course, today we actually have, or have a lot of experiments with.
Nikola Tesla was found dead in his hotel room, butt naked except for some socks. He was 86 years old, and the fate of his death ray was unclear, which caused a massive scramble to get to any plans or information that remained in his safes or in his various apartments or buildings that he had lived in. The FBI, utilizing a law dealing with alien property rights, seized all of Tesla's belongings and impounded them in a storage unit in Midtown Manhattan. These were, and I kid you not, reviewed by an MIT scientist who happens to be the uncle of one Donald Trump.
Are you serious?
Yes. His name was John Trump, MIT scientist and lecturer and professor. He reviewed those and he said they were basically bumpkus. But hold on just a minute, because at some point the Soviet Union did in fact pay Tesla $25,000 to investigate beam weapons in 1939.
That's true.
Yeah. Surprisingly, the Cold War begins after World War II. Khrushchev comes into power in the Soviet Union and releases some claims about a super weapon that is near to being complete and leaks diagrams of it, which look surprisingly like some of Nikola Tesla's diagrams of his death ray.
Well, Khrushchev was big on the propaganda piece.
He was indeed. So there's even some claims that this inspired the Star Wars program Reagan propagated in the 80s. We just really never saw any real manifestation of the death ray from the time that Tesla passed away to now. At least I've not ever seen anything. And honestly, I haven't been looking, but if someone had a large beam weapon that would mow down thousands of people, I mean, if the Russians had this, honestly, do you think Ukraine would be going as long as it has so far? No, I don't think so.
It was popular in the 1930s, and I think a lot of it had to do with, here's electricity in the late 19th century, sort of a mystical force that's powering the world now by the 1930s. Then we have the invention of cosmic rays. Radio waves are still relatively new. In fact, it's proposed that a lot of people who were inventing with ways to transmit power, including Tesla, but other inventors as well, led to the development of radar, because it was the experimentation of radio waves, trying to beam radio waves at airplanes and things, and then they get this return signal bouncing back, and they're like, hey, we could actually use this to at least detect something, if not shoot it down, right?
Yeah.
And it was a lot of talk. I had a great article on it, and I can't find it now, of course, but I had a really cool article that had like newspaper clippings about death rays and stuff all over the place, not just from Tesla, but it was just a big thing in the 1930s. I think after World War II came along, and then we had the atomic bomb, which was definitely real and something that was just unbelievably destructive, but also this new power of harnessing the atom for not only weapons, but also for the generation of electricity and other uses that, the world in the 1940s and 50s, everything was atomic powered, so that became the thing after that, was nuclear energy. And we saw a lot less of the death rate. But I do know for a fact that lasers exist, and we have the United States military at least has experimented with high-powered lasers as anti-missile devices. That's a known fact, and also it's known that they do a lot of experimentation with particle accelerators. In fact, that's what Bob Lazar got in trouble when he got in trouble going out to Area 51 when he was telling everyone they were watching UFOs. It was actually, from what I understand, experiments and particle beam weapons is what they were experimenting with the nights that he was out there.
Yeah, back to Tesla, one of my favorite stories about Tesla was that after he passed away, we have Donald Trump's uncle, John Trump. He goes and he looks at the death ray and he says, this is bumpkus, nothing. But then he finds out that Tesla had lived in a hotel before, because he lived in multiple hotels and racked up bills. And then once the bills got too high for him to pay, he'd move to another hotel. Eventually, Westinghouse would pay for his hotels, just out of I think probably out of a sense of duty to him, as well as basically they wanted to keep him out of negative PR because he was so instrumental and so tied to the company, at least in the early years, and they wanted to sort of minimize any negative publicity that may have come out of it.
He was still an iconic individual.
Exactly. I mean, once a year he'd come out with his birthday, and lots of celebrities would come out to celebrate and acknowledge it. Anyway, at one of these previous hotels, he had left a brown paper bag or brown paper box there with something in it, and the letter attached to it claimed that inside of this box was a prototype that was worth more than $10,000 of his oscillating device, and that if opened incorrectly, it would detonate. So, so terrorist Tesla left behind a bomb, and they give this bomb to the physicist who looked into the death ray papers and said, this is crap. Now, the physicist gets this Tesla box and says, I'm not sure I want to open this thing. He says it could be booby trapped. But after thinking over all the papers that he had seen, he thought, it's probably all right. And he opens it up, and instead of some scary, terrifying device, what he finds is a Wheatstone bridge, which is a tool for measuring electrical resistance. Basically a common tool for electrical measurements and
an ohm meter.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it was basically just some more piece of junk. Certainly not a death ray, and definitely not some kind of bomb. So just another sad fact that Tesla, by the end of his life, had really fallen pretty far from the genius.
Well, maybe he had a sense of humor. I think everyone would find that after he was long gone.
Actually, that's a good point. He had Serbian sense of humor. Those Serbs with those bomb jokes.
Here's one of the most interesting quotes I found from him. In an interview that he gave to John Kennedy in 1926, he explains how wireless energy could help us have long-distance communication. Now, this is what he said. He said, when wireless is perfectly applied, the whole Earth will be converted into a huge brain, which in fact it is. All things being particles of a real and rhythmic whole. We shall be able to communicate with one another instantly, irrespective of distance. Not only this, but through television and telephones. We shall see and hear one another as perfectly as though we were face to face, despite intervening distances of thousands of miles, and the instruments through which we shall be able to do this will be amazingly simple compared with our present telephone. A man will be able to carry one in his vest pocket.
That's crazy talk. Never happened.
It sounds like a cell phone.
That sounds like fantasy talk there. That man's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, huh?
So definitely a visionary for sure.
Here, you mentioned pigeons. Here's something he was quoted as saying, "I have been feeding pigeons, thousands of them for years, but there was one beautiful bird, pure white.
Yep, that's the one.
With light gray tips on its wings." Huh?
That's the one, the love of his life.
That one was different. It was a female. I had only to wish and call her, and she would come flying to me. I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me.
Wait, whoa. Did you say, as a man loves a woman?
That's what he said.
That could have contributed to its death.
As long as I had her, there was a purpose in my life. Yeah, he never married. He was a loner.
Except for that pigeon.
Yeah, except for the pigeon, obviously.
Right. Lord, I hope that was a beefy pigeon.
You know, he wasn't an unattractive man. He was 6'2". He was, pretty refined.
Had an accent.
Yeah, but he was quoted at one time saying, "I can't think of many great inventions behind which are married men." He considered romance and that sort of thing to be a distraction from his work.
Yeah. You know, I had heard that he also created or utilized neon. For...
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I think...
Neon and fluorescent lights.
Yeah, he created the first neon light, and I think he had... It was a flashing light, neon light that said Edison smells, because Edison famously apparently had issues with hygiene. So he was... That was... I mean, he could have done anything, and he does a sign that says Edison smells. I don't know what that's about, but...
Well, Jimmy, do you have anything else you want to add to tonight's show?
Yeah, I just want to wrap it up with this. I think that there's a lot of conspiracy and myth built up around Nikola Tesla that really is overdone. And if you look at the man and give him kudos for the things he actually did, which are extraordinary for that time and for his life, we don't have to go outside of the realm of reality to appreciate the contributions of Tesla. And certainly, we don't have to build him up and give him accolades for a death ray that's never manifested everywhere, an earthquake machine that's never manifested anywhere, and certainly none of his papers, which really, for the time, showed a lack of understanding. Well, maybe not a lack of understanding, but with everything we know now, we've certainly been able to point out the errors in the thinkings that are found in those papers, as our science has really excelled beyond that point in time and allowed us to see that Tesla was a genius for his time, but that he had many things wrong with some of the ideas that he had late in his life, and that we've really come to a point where we understand science much better now, and that those things were never going to really work. I'm just saying.
All right, my final thought is, I think it's ironic that Elon Musk named his electric car company Tesla whenever the cars are powered by DC energy.
Tesla's turning over in his grave.
Now, on the other hand, you charge the batteries using AC, alternating current, but the car itself is powered by direct current. So, I don't know.
I mean, well, it's not like you have
Maybe you should have called it the Edison.
Well, it's like you don't have to travel a huge distance, from the battery to the engine of the car to get to go. You don't need that high voltage.
Right. Well, direct current is more efficient or better for batteries, which is what we use. Yeah, we still extensively use DC power for sure.
Hey, do you think Tesla's going to buy Twitter?
Oh, you mean Elon Musk?
Oh, yeah. Elon Musk, yeah. I get them mixed up. They look so much alike.
I don't care. I don't do the Twitter, so I don't care if he buys it or not.
You don't twit? Do they call it twit?
I don't.
Or tweets?
I don't do the tweet.
You don't do the. I would call it twits. I'm not twitting today.
My wife was on Twitter for a while just to see some of the outrageous comments of certain individuals that were on there that would be tweets from time to time, but she finally ditched it.
Yeah, we have a Twitter account. We never really do anything on it.
Do we?
We do. I reserved it at the same time we did all the other stuff, but I've never been on it. We should get on it and just start making outlandish claims.
Okay. Well, let's just retweet some of the stories we have on Facebook. I try to update our Facebook account with UFO, paranormal, sometimes just weird science stories. I get it on about every couple or 3 days and look for new stories. and post them on there. So, listeners, look for us on Facebook if you're interested in that. Also, look for us on Instagram. Jimmy does some very funny things on Instagram, usually making fun of me, but that's okay.
Not always. You're just an easy target.
As I had mentioned at the first of the show, send us an email at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. Just, if you have suggestions for the show or just want to say hello, that would be awesome. But in particular, if you have a story you'd like to share of an unusual encounter you yourself have had, or even if it's someone that you know. I was thinking about this just the other day. I remember that a friend of mine had told me that, I think it was his mother, and this was years ago, but I think his mom and maybe sister had saw a flying saucer hovering through a valley and then just go up a hill and down like it was hugging nap of the earth, going across a field, and they observed it for something like 6 or 7 seconds. I mean, it was not just a flash. And but as years went on, they started changing the story, like, well, I think it was something else. I think it may have been an airplane or whatever. And then someone I know very well saw a flying saucer, and as the years went on, the story changed. She's like, yeah, it was probably just a helicopter out in the field or something like that. I think it's easy to talk yourself out of stories like that, right? And start wondering if that's really what you saw. So even if you have a case like that, listeners, I'd be very interested to hear that. Share it with the rest of our listeners. You can remain totally anonymous.
Or not.
Jimmy, do you have anything else you want to add tonight?
No, other than, no. I don't have anything, man. I have nothing.
All right, then. Well, let's get on out of here. This is Stephen Hawk signing out, and we'll see you next week.
And Jimmy Coe, keep your eyes to the skies and your feet on the ground. We'll catch you next week.
Yeah, watch out. I'm going to hit you with my death ray.
I'm not worried. I've got a force field.
All right, well, I'll get you with my earthquake machine then.
I don't believe it works.
Oh, yeah? Watch. I can do it from here. Watch.
You just making sounds with your mouth.
See?
You're shaking your camera. You're an idiot.
All right, man. I'll see you next time.
All right, later. That's all for this week's episode of Cosmic Sponge. Please don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions or have a story you'd like to share, you can contact us using our email account at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. If you'd like to support the show, consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/cosmicsponge, where you get access to exclusive content, including our Weird Wonders, news, and stories released every week. To explore everything Cosmic Sponge has to offer, including other ways to support the show, head on over to our website at www.cosmicsponge.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.